All things SciComm. What does the future of science look like? What's happening in science communication? Here's your host, Nikesh Gosalia.
Hey everyone, welcome to All Things SciComm. All Things SciComm is a weekly podcast brought to you by Science Talks, a media platform that aims to make science accessible to everyone. In this program, we'll dive into the latest from the sci-tech world. A little bit about myself. My name is Nikesh Gosalia and I'm joining you from London. I've been part of the science communication and scholarly publishing industry for more than 14 years. I've had the privilege of working with researchers, academic publishers, journals, societies, and universities. It is my absolute pleasure to be hosting this podcast about the latest in science, tech, and research, an area that I'm tremendously passionate about. So let's get started with our first episode.
All things SciComm. Today's innovator. Knock knock.
Today, I'm chatting with David Worlock. David is one of the veterans of scholarly publishing, having begun his career in the 1960s. And he's had the privilege of starting one of the first online publishing services way back in 1985. David has spent decades in creating strategies and solutions for publishers and content companies. David is a very dear friend as well. And so welcome, David.
Thank you very much.
So I don't know if I've done justice to the introduction, David, but if you would want to elaborate more on that and talk a little bit about your journey in the publishing industry, I think that would really be beneficial for the listeners.
Well, for me, Nikesh, listening to your kind introduction, I reflect that I am pre-digital man. So I have lived through the digital revolution in all its various stages. And I do reflect that one of the great gulfs in understanding in our society, really, is the idea that when we took the world of print and put it into digital form, we had accomplished something revolutionary. We had not. We had simply transformed the medium of communication. And now we are deep in what is a real digital revolution. And that is beginning to flow through scholarly communications. And it suggests to me wholly different ways in which the processes which we inherited from the print world, from the pre-digital world, may be transformed, truncated, or developed, or improved in a genuinely digital environment, a born digital environment.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you, David. So let's start at what seems like the very basis of scholarly communication as we know it today, the article. So I've obviously read a lot of your blog posts. I've heard you say that article is not for reading. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and say that?
Yes, I say that simply to keep my readers awake. If you've got this far. But look, we live in a wholly different world when it comes to accessing information. So we have inherited the world where articles appeared in print and people read them in order to stay up to date. Or they read NI abstracts, they read intelligence about articles in order to keep up to date. Now, patently, we're living in a world where it is impossible to stay up to date in that readership way. I don't know what the latest estimate is, but the last one I saw, I think from Delta Think, was around 470,000 articles published in the 2 years of the pandemic on COVID research. No COVID researcher has read all of that. So we have to use other intelligent methodologies to scan this information and look at it. Add to that, there is huge time pressure now in our systems. Getting research to the front line as fast as we possibly can becomes extremely important. So we see on the 25th anniversary of Archive, we see that what started out almost as a science-based server for putting up articles in preparation, we see the full development of preprint servers. And that again suggests to me that the digital age will craft out its own ways of making intelligence available for artificial intelligence searching and for other forms of inquiry without necessarily going through the publication process as we know it in our present ecosystem. So here are revolutionary changes on our doorstep. And they come about not just because we have the tech, They come about because of the pressure of a research-based, highly R&D orientated society, not just in Europe and America, but of course in China, Japan, and in India as well.
No, that's very interesting, David. And maybe I'll come back to your point about scanning intelligently, all the research that's available, but we'll probably come back to that. And I know that just an extension of what you've mentioned, you've also said that researchers do not write articles. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, indeed I can. Well, just as a researcher cannot read all of the material available, it does seem to me increasingly likely that we will use intelligent means to assemble research findings. At this stage, I'm beginning to call them research findings rather than articles. We have a familiar pattern from the print world, from the pre-digital world, of what an article contains. It begins with an abstract, of course, and then it has the laying out of a claim, a hypothesis. And then we generally follow that with a methodology for exploring that hypothesis and demonstrating its truth or its falsehood. And then we have findings arising from that, maybe statistical, maybe evidential findings from the experimentation. And then we have a literature review. And we have all of these structures which we have built out. And then we have a citation index. We've built in all of these structures into the publishing ecosystem. Actually, of course, that material is available at different times in the course of a research process. If you were strict followers, I guess, of the world of open science, you would say, well, there is an important break in the middle of that one should, at the beginning of an experimental activity, publish the hypothesis and publish the methodology. Then one should wait till the end of the research process and publish the results, knowing that the initial parts being publicly available could not be altered, and that people would see whether you would have had hit your objectives or whether you had been unable to demonstrate them. Now, whether that methodology will become prevalent, I do not know. But it does seem to me that much of what we're going to publish in the future, as now, comes off the lab notebook, comes off the automated structures that we put in place when we made the research grant, comes off the machinery of input which accompanies our research processes. Now, posting that material to a preprint server or to a repository. I think only PLOS has a pre-registration repository at the moment, but I expect to see more of those. Then it breaks up the article in its structure and opens it up to much greater automation of filing of the various parts of this activity. Therefore, the article may itself fragment in time, but be united in linkage online.
Very interesting. So I know that you briefly mentioned open science, and maybe I'll come to that in a minute. But just going back to a very interesting point that you made, David, around scanning just the huge volumes of research that we have intelligently. Are there one or two tips or emerging trends that you see that you would like to talk about? And then we can move to the other topic.
I think the vital thing about this whole world is metadata. Time and time again, I see a sort of metadata neglect taking place. And this makes life very, very difficult for the linked world that we're talking about. I was fascinated at this year's APE conference in Berlin last week to hear the conversation around metadata, especially where it was concerned with tracking retractions and articles which made false claims or which might mislead other researchers. You're never going to be able to find that material or have it delineated for you unless the metadata is in place. It is a potent way for people to mislead themselves. So adding that metadata, adding it in full, adding it stage by stage, I think becomes the critical factor here. When I look back to the old days of the beginnings of Crossref and realize that we thought we'd done what we needed to do in metadata terms when we simply attached a number when we simply put a DOI on things and forgot that we need to put a DOI on every part of these things, and forgot what we needed to do to extracted terms, and forgot what we needed to do to make sure that we could make claims identifiable. And here again, we are there's a group in Germany beginning to talk about nanopublishing so that you can distinguish claims digitally across bodies of material. That is where we're going. I'm absolutely convinced of it. It's the only way in which machine-to-machine interoperability takes place. And it's much more important now that our machines are fully able to access everything and know what it is than that we are.
Yeah, absolutely. Regarding open science, you've said in the past that open science is not a lens, but a prism. And in other words, people have very different emotions about quote unquote open. So can we talk a little bit more about open science, open research, and in your opinion, what are your thoughts about it?
Let me use another metaphor. I think open science is a climate, and it is one which is increasingly pervasive. I think a younger generation of researchers will be intolerant of some of the practices which marked out journal publishing in some of the worst of the bad old days, by which I mean the clear favoritism of editorial boards for a particular line of research or thinking, the inability of people who queried that approach to get published in certain leading outlets, the sorts of, which we say, academic but very human bullying, which has taken place and which has sometimes shaded real results coming to the fore. But I also think we have to have a time frame here. We love to sort of stamp things with a stamp of approval, peer reviewed, and that means something to many people and less than something in a lot of different contexts. So I take as an example the two physicists who won the Nobel Prize in 2021. Two of the three physicists who won the prize in 2021. Two of them are in their late 70s, early 80s. The articles for which they are cited as having won the prize were almost unrecognized at the time. It took 20 years for those articles to come to the fore. And we think that at point of publication, we know everything we need to know in judgment terms about whether this is worthy science, distinguished science, or pretentious rubbish. It is absurd. What we need to do is to track the progress of articles over 20 years. We need to have our systems in place to be able to tell you what is rising in estimation, what has now been recognized as being a real line of inquiry while it was dismissed at publication. And we don't have that in place in our systems, but in a digital world, we can have that in place in our systems.
Very interesting. And just staying with open science, I think another trend that we've been seeing, David, is also a lot of conversations around impact. Right through the entire process, all the stakeholders have been talking about, what is the real impact of all the research that we do. There is a lot of work also starting to happen around dissemination and engagement. Any thoughts on that, David?
Yeah, certainly. So we are living in an open access world, even more than in the world of paid publication. It is common in many places that dissemination ends at publication. I have put it into the system, and therefore anybody who needs it can find it. What a falsity that is in the attention economy of the internet. That is a hopeless position to take, in my view. Therefore, we need to disseminate, and we need to do everything we can to ensure high impact. I think in a few years' time, young researchers will be demanding of open access publishers, give me the assurance that if I put this through your outlet, that you will personally, or as a service, you will alert all of the leading players in my sector. In the age of knowledge graphs, it is very simple to map a research sector, to find out where the researchers are, who is doing leading or even indeed competitive work, and to make sure that everybody knows. Disseminating in the flaccid way in which we are at the moment, it has no real excuse, it seems to me. Then we can begin to measure impact. We can begin to say who used that and what sort of response did it get. And then we can begin to monitor the blogs and the conferences. Here again, you see, with companies like Cassini and Maurissier, the conferences are now getting, and the seminars, the in-house seminars of the research groups are now getting monitored. So here we are in a position where we can see what the impact is, if only we can devise the tools to measure it. So I think we're going to go through an impact and dissemination revolution in the next 5 years. And scholarship will benefit hugely from that.
Absolutely. No, and I fully agree with you, David. I think it's a trend that you're already seeing. We've had the research excellence framework here in the UK as well. And the importance of impact is just growing. And I agree with you. I think there is going to be a revolution, which is probably much needed.
Well, I would say to you, and you mentioned the UK researchers. Well, it was fascinating to me that the UK research body chose to fund a scheme called Octopus to the tune of £650,000 to do initial research studies into how to improve publication processes. And one of course, those improvements is about impact. It seems to me that even the award of that grant is calling out subscription-based publishing as inadequate, not doing the job, not getting the articles to the people who need them. And so I think that, I'm not sure I entirely agree with that thesis, but I think it shows a will amongst the research community to see endemic change take place.
Yeah.
That's all the time we have today. Catch more of this episode in the next part with your host, Nikesh Gosalia. See you soon.